We see ourselves competing with Sotheby's, Christie's, the established players, trying to usher in the next kind of movement of what art looks like in the digital age as we come to terms with this crazy new reality that we're living in. One of the key differentiators that we want to strive for is credible neutrality. There's so much inside dealing, preferential treatment, and just opaqueness in how those markets operate, which makes them very inefficient as markets. We wanted to take that a step further, having all of our auction houses and order books on chain lead to more efficient markets where anybody can participate in auctions, anybody can list artworks for auctions.
I think those are huge because in the traditional art world, all of it is so extremely centralized.
It's tricky. Curation requires opinion. We've learned through very hard experience. It requires some degrees of a singular vision, consistency, letting collectors know what to expect so that you can have coherence in the presentation to the user. And that's very difficult to achieve in a totally decentralized setting.
Hey everybody, welcome back to our sixth and final episode of Roll Call. I cannot believe it's our final episode already. I am joined by my co-host, Nick Naraghi. You all know him as the co-founder of Hats Protocol. And we have two special guests today. We have Brennan Mulligan, who is the general manager at RareDAO Foundation. And we also have Karel Olivier, who is the co-founder and CEO of Lemma. Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Great being here.
Great to have this crew. Karel and Brennan are both key members of the Hats Proto DAO, and I've been kind of working alongside them for a couple of seasons now through Hats. And so this is a really fun time. We were all together in Detroit just a few months ago doing an in-person Hats convening. So it's great to bring everybody back again after that IRL meetup. And I'm just really excited to talk to you guys. And so where I want to start is with RareDAO and with kind of the history of Rare a little bit. And so a lot of people know SuperRare as this NFT platform, this NFT marketplace, but I think not a lot of people really know the ins and outs of how the DAO was formed from that, and even where the DAO stands today and how it's evolving and what are all the new things that you guys are working on. So just very briefly, Brennan, could you start by telling us a little bit about the history of how RareDAO was formed and what that process of progressive decentralization has looked like up till today?
Absolutely. So, you touched on it briefly, but SuperRare is a one-of-one crypto art platform featuring some of the biggest sales in the space. We've sold X copies for millions of dollars and are really trying to pioneer an entire new movement within international art. So we see ourselves competing with Sotheby's, Christie's, and sort of the established players in art auction houses and galleries worldwide, trying to usher in the next kind of movement of what art looks like in the digital age as we come to terms with this crazy new reality that we're living in. And one of the key differentiators with those legacy platforms is that we want to strive for is credible neutrality. There's so much like inside dealing and preferential treatment and just opaqueness in how those markets operate, which makes them very inefficient as markets. So already having all of our auction houses and order books and that sort of thing on chain lead to more efficient markets where anybody can participate in auctions. Anybody can list artworks for auctions, assuming they've gone through just some basic whitelisting on our platform. But we wanted to take that a step further. So in 2021, before I was with the company, the DAO was formed. And there were two main goals here. One was to kind of bring some capture resistance to the whitelisting process itself, formalizing the relationship of SuperRare Labs to the community as sort of this central gatekeeper, and starting to experiment with decentralized curation mechanisms. But more impactful over the long term has been just really encoding capture resistance around the protocol. So the auction houses, the tokens themselves, how artist royalties are flowed through every transaction, as well as the control of the token supply, which has really been like kind of this oyster little piece of dust that's formed this pearl in our culture. And particularly over the last year, that's really blossomed on the Farcaster community side of things. So that's the main focus of the DAO today, is providing provenance to the works that move through our marketplace by ensuring collectors and artists that the means for exchange is decentrally controlled and that the assets themselves are tamper resistant and, fully secure.
Yeah, I think those are huge because in the traditional art world, all of it is so extremely centralized, like even beyond, I think, a lot of casual collectors or observers of art even realize. And so it's a huge challenge that you guys are tackling, trying to decentralize this very traditional art world. What have been some of the biggest challenges that you guys have faced over since 2021 when RareDAO was formed and we thought about how to decentralize various aspects of this process?
Yeah, it's tricky. Curation as a problem is one that requires opinion. And to do it well, we've learned through very hard experience, it requires some degrees of a singular vision, consistency, letting collectors know what to expect so that you can have coherence in the presentation to the user. And that's very difficult to achieve in a totally decentralized setting. So we actually drew a lot of inspiration from the capture resistance framework developed by Spencer and the Hats team generally, and thought about like, okay, well, we tried experimenting with totally opening this up. We tried experimenting with creating more of a federated model, but we need a way to create positions of authority that are still held in balance with the entire system. And we need mechanisms for oversight. We need mechanisms for authority. And starting about when I started with the company 2 years ago, we began implementing HATS protocol in our back office, kind of foundation management type stuff. And we're now starting to run curatorial experiments on top of that model. In particular with our rare collection, where we're collecting art every month from people in the community using a Gnosis safe that will be secured by HATS. And like really trying to emphasize the role of people being put in a position that grants them authority, rather than those people just innately having that authority. This allows the foundation, the community, anybody who's concerned to say like, maybe this person's interests and the purpose that this role was created for are diverging. And then we can revoke that role and make changes to that power structure. So we're kind of approaching it on both sides of like, how do we run a capture resistant organization, really dry, standard corporate governance? And then how do we also take the parallels that exist there and solve a really hard problem, which is creating a high signal to noise ratio in a content abundant environment where everybody is creating more art than has ever been created, especially with generative AI tools. And so how do we create a voice that people can trust that is a signifier of quality and relevance culturally, but is still representative, isn't hyper centralized, but still is able to form a coherent opinion and stand behind it.
Do you think that implementing HATS has almost forced RareDAO to think more closely about what those roles are and what levels and types of power you guys want various entities to have that are all participating in this decentralized ecosystem around SuperRare?
Definitely. A great example is probably like our work with Karel. So Karel, as Lemma Solutions, he's our supervisor of the RareDAO Foundation. They also serve in accounting and like secretarial role. So he and I work a ton on this back office stuff that keeps the machine running. And it's been really interesting to explore the way in which, we're two entities, we've signed an agreement, we're working together. And at first that started out as like a one-to-one role-to-role relationship. And then as that has expanded, okay, well now we have one person from Lemma doing this thing over here. We have another person doing this thing over here. Do they deserve the same permissions? Like they come from the same company, but they're doing two totally different jobs. And so as sort of a poly-organizational organization, a cooperative effort from service providers, the original core team, community members, that sort of thing, HATS has allowed us to kind of dig between the traditional boundaries that we use to define contribution and go more granular into the roles that people are actually filling and the authorities needed to execute those roles properly. That ultimately has like really increased our security and making sure that we can properly map and talk about the actual power in the organization, while also just making the system easier to understand. Like every team, every company is so complex with like, well, Diana ran that process for like 4 years. I'm not super sure how it worked. We didn't really write it down. And then she left and nobody knows what to do. Having the role kind of thesis guiding how we structure not only our organization, but also our work keeps us more disciplined about process documentation and forming institutional knowledge and culture over time, which ultimately is going to increase the validity of what we're doing and increase community trust because it becomes more reliable, efficient, and predictable year after year.
Brennan, I would also add to that longevity, I think, is a key part about this. And it was fascinating to see in the last 12 months, the hat structure we had initially and the hat structure we have now is not the same. And a large part about that was there was this literal role discovery where things were going fairly smoothly. One change came into the picture and we sat down and said, oh, this is actually a fundamental change that we need to now incorporate into the structure to make it more efficient and to make it last longer and work better in general. And I think that's what the beauty of hats is as well. It's a very adaptable structure that you can use instead of a very rigid set method of it's this way or the highway. And the impact of that on Rare has been fundamental in how we operate as a foundation, but also as a DAO going forward.
What was that fundamental change, by the way, that forced you guys to change the hats tree completely?
In this case, it sounds so simple. It was accounting.
Yeah.
It was. We got to the point where we suddenly started realizing that how it works traditionally is you have a person who's loading payments and another person who's approving payments. But that doesn't really exist in the traditional, in the crypto world as natively as it perhaps should. But what also started happening was Brennan and I used to be on a call, and he would review, I would do. It worked out beautifully. We approve, we move on. And then as the organization matured, we realized we now needed additional sets of people. And he spoke about this earlier. And when we got to that point, it was suddenly, well, if I'm sitting as a supervisor and I have a lot of rights and privileges in that position, that should not be transferred directly to any one individual going forward because it doesn't logically make sense. And there's a risk attached to it. And we started creating these little sub-branches. And I think we've mapped out our tree for 2 or 3 years in advance, thinking these are the new positions that we're going to start creating as we mature further. But that was also very much a discovery process that we went through. And Brennan brought a beautiful picture, and 2 months later, you redrew that picture. 2 months later, you redrew that picture again. At this point, I think it's a bit tired, but every iteration has been better than the previous one. And I think that's exactly what it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, Brennan.
Yeah, something that you touched on there, Karel, is that iterative nature. That happens in any organization. Organizations are always in flux. The question is, to what degree is the leadership of that organization participating actively and deliberately in that change? Are you designing your organization, or is the chaos of your organization designing you? Changing your behaviors, your habits, your communication flows. Treating the most fundamental aspects of your business, how people interact with each other, power, and their core responsibilities. That's the core criteria for a good leader on a team. And Hats gives the substrate for Karel and I to be able to do that. It gives us a way to interact deliberately with these aspects of human organization that are normally opaque.
Yeah, I'm curious too to hear from Nick's perspective, because I think this group is so perfect to talk about Rare, because we've got Brennan, who's been building out RareDAO since maybe not the very beginning, but the very early days. And then Karel, who's come in kind of recently to help with more back office stuff. And then Nick, who's come in to help with this hats tree stuff. Nick, I'm curious from your perspective, when you had the opportunity to jump in and work with Brennan and Karel on all of this, what was your perspective on, I guess, how their organization was structured, how those changes over time took place? What's your thought process or your perspective on that?
Yeah. When we first saw the draft of the first hats tree, or we're starting to sort of design it maybe almost 2 years ago, was one of the first really robust hats trees ever, and sort of had the structure of a elected committee, the SuperRare council that was a multi-sig of 7 people, and then subgroups, the grants committee and operations group, and then the foundation, and the foundation sort of included in the tree. It just felt like a really strong example. Okay, as someone who's building technology to support this, that this smells like product market fit direction. Like we're heading in the right direction. So that was really exciting. And then, that we did a lot of our sort of incremental product development and philosophical thinking with that as a backdrop. It was like, this is a really good example. It works really well. We have a great case study, can share it with more people. And I think that has sort of rippled out in the space to other DAOs that wanted to do similar things and sort of copying the rare tree V1. And then the V2, Brennan came to us, I think maybe three-ish months ago. He was like, I think this is what we want to do for V2. And he had the whole, a lot of times we spend a bunch of time with people trying to like figure it out with them. And Brennan came with like the whole thing mapped out. This tree 1, tree 2, 30-minute Loom video walking through everything. This is what we're doing. And we said, this is amazing because Brennan is like the best Hats protocol user in the world right now. Like he knows what to do. He's got like developed the cutting edge of the thinking, and he's presenting back to us like, okay, here's some like 6 very technical questions about the different accountability relationships and how to implement them. And it's just been amazing to be in co-creation and partnership with someone who we're really, we're building something for this really strong use case. Brennan is able to take the pattern language of it and the composable building blocks and run with them. And we can keep making improvements that support that. It's extraordinarily fulfilling and really exciting for us, I think, on the team.
That's awesome to hear. I think that's like not an easy thing to do. And I understand why, Nick, you and the team spend so much time kind of almost like one-on-one hand-holding people in different organizations through creating the Hats tree, because there's, like the like boring stuff like accounting that Karel brought up earlier that like are super important and impactful, just not like the interesting stuff that people working in DAOs really care about. And then there's like the human relational side things, which is the kind of thing that people working in the space really care about. And you kind of have to find some sort of organizational structure that works for both sides, like both the boring back end side of things and then also like the fun interpersonal side of things that everybody sees. And so on more of that like fun interpersonal side of things, Brennan, I've heard you talk about relationships between people in DAOs in terms of like functional versus implied relationships. And I've also heard you use the words legalware, socialware, and trustware, and talk about how those 3 things have to fit in together in order for an organization to work. So I would love to sort of pivot towards that direction and ask you to explain a little bit more what you think just talk more in general about like functional versus implied relationships, and then how you think about legalware, socialware, and trustware fitting in together.
Yeah. Business is entirely about people. Like that is something that has been hammered into me over the course of my career, that we're just coordinating people to accomplish shared goals so that we can pay rent and help our communities create something exciting. And there are many ways of coordinating people. There are many like mediums through which coordination can occur. And so in really early on, talking and kind of just jamming with the Hats team, I can't remember exactly where it came. I think it was coming out of Metropolis at the time, but this concept of trustware of like, don't just, DAOs aren't vibes. That was a big kind of topic of conversation coming out of DeFi summer. And like, we had these huge market caps. We weren't exactly sure like why, or like the compound governor stuff wasn't going super great, but it wasn't totally broken either. So we're just like, what is a DAO? You have some that are totally decentralized. You have some that are over here. Well, DAOs are just vibes. And so that's sort of the socialware element, right? It's people coordinating. It's people caring about pluralism. It's people having cultural rituals and practices that draw them together for like intersubjectivity and just cohesive consensus building mechanisms at that social layer. And that's really great, but that isn't all that DAOs are or will be or were. And that's not what coordination systems are. Humans are more than our social relationships because we can also build systems. One of the greatest coordination mechanisms ever developed, the law, is like an incredible coordination mechanism that I think in Web3 we really discount because we have like an anti-incumbency bias. The law has been around for a long time, and there's many aspects of it that are incredibly unjust. But that doesn't mean that as a dispute resolution framework, It is not very good at what it does. So we, as DAO contributors and operators, need to have literacy in the legal structure of our organization and the agreements that exist between our organizations, because that's one of these fundamental pieces of software that allows us to interface with each other. On a similar side is the trustware. And this is where early experiments and sort of small group organizing on chain through Gnosis Safe, through Metropolis, through HATS, all these sort of players around in 2021 were trying to get, how do we encode trust? You have the vibes, the social interactions, that community. You have the formal off-chain legal relationships, but how do we make trust mechanical? How do we create a physics for the organization that is undeniable and unavoidable? And how do we design that physics in such a way that the objects in our organization move in a way that is efficient and creates value? And that's more possible now than ever has been. And that comes down to the use of smart contracts as integral parts of your organization. So by really developing strong socialware, by the cultural practices, I think this is most evident for me in the HATS Proto DAO, where we have 3-time annual kind of seasons that each contain convenings within them, where we have this cadence of new opportunity at the beginning of the season, assessing opportunity in the middle, and then sharing the results of that opportunity at the end in this sort of cyclical cadence, married with 2 wonderfully facilitated in-person convenings a year through David and Dan. David, one of the co-founders, and Dan, just a critical member of the Proto DAO. That fabric is so important for HATS Proto DAO. And I think that it is probably unparalleled in the whole industry in terms of how strong a culture it's been able to create within that group. The legalware side of things, obviously super important. I like to think that this is one of the places where SuperRare is doing well. Metalux is another great product that is really trying to unite the legal agreements that create an organization with these other mechanics, especially the trustware. So there are more and more experiments happening of how do you make the legal agreements actionable, programmable, targetable by these other realms of organization. And then lastly, the trustware. Over the last 2 years, HATS has gone from 0 to 60 and beyond. Gnosis Safe is and when you just look at the surface, that hasn't changed at all. But we have products like Den now, so that it's way more usable. The library of Zodiac modules is way higher. You can deploy safes across multiple chains using the same address, all these basic little building blocks. So all of that together, I think we're at a point where all of these kind of separate areas of coordination are starting to tie in a lot more together. And you can more cohesively design the structure and operations and culture of an organization using each of these 3 things as ingredients, rather than discrete areas where you have a single specialist kind of in a...
I love that framing. Yeah. We need all 3 in order for something to succeed. And I think, like you were saying, in the early days of DAOs, we maybe over-optimized a little bit for the socialware and the vibes, and a little, not enough on especially the legalware side of things. And now I think in this next iteration of DAOs, this next cycle of DAOs, I think we're honing in more on the legal side of things and the regulatory side of things. And that's, I know, with Lemma, that's what you're working on, Karel, day in and day out, is thinking through these regulatory challenges. So I'd love to talk about some of those things too, and hear your perspective on just where we stand with that. I think 2024, when I look back on that, on this year, I think that regulatory challenges or solutions that was a big theme of 2024. I think, just with the ETFs getting approved earlier in the year, Bitcoin ETF and the ETH ETF getting approved in the first half of the year. And then with the US election happening in November, that kind of swayed things a lot. There was just a lot of talk about regulatory things. We even had SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce on Rehash earlier, which just tells you, how much the community is really thinking about legal and regulatory issues right now. So I'm curious, Karel, from your perspective and all the work you've done through Lemma, what are some of the main or biggest regulatory challenges that you see DAOs facing today?
First off, it's actually scary to think that the Bitcoin ETF was only approved this year.
Yeah,
Slightly take me back there.
So I think it was January 2024, so almost a whole year ago. So if that makes you feel any better.
And now Bitcoin's at $100,000. So,
right.
Absolutely insane how that growth's been. On the regulatory side, we have more clarity, which is fantastic. But there's still a lot of unknowns, right? And I think that a large part about what that comes into play is the space has matured significantly from when Brennan was speaking, when it was vibes. And we've started to see that it's moved away from an idea to a concept that actually is fundamentally changing the way we operate. And it's similar to, I keep going back to this, but it's similar to when you think about when the first company was created. That initial foray was almost this conception of, well, this could work. We actually have no idea. And that iteration, starting in the 1600s, took us 300 years to get to what we now view as a company and know and understand. And it's become so fundamental that the concept of a company, which is a completely human-made concept, is something that we all just understand natively, as that's how the world works. And we're seeing the next iteration of that when it comes to DAOs, to foundations. And that results in a lot of regulatory uncertainty by its very nature. And we're working very hard to almost adapt new technology to what has existed and what has operated and worked in the past. Small things that we started to at least start seeing is purely on the banking side. 2 years ago, opening up a bank account for any company that said crypto was a near impossible task. Bank accounts are now, it's still not easy, but you can do it at least. And you can get to a yes more often than not. Just the fact that that's happened, that crypto companies can start interacting with the traditional financial banking sector, already shows how much greater clarity there is on the regulatory side. I think as we start proceeding and going into 2025, a lot of the other questions that will start coming into play is potentially KYC, KYB, and AML legislation and what that means and what the operational needs are from that perspective. The next administration in the US will give us arguably the biggest set of clarity, maybe even since crypto began in 2008. Bold statement, could be wrong, but I'm willing to stick to it. And I think that all of that speaks well to just how far this industry developed, but also the impact of the key players in this industry. And organizations like HATS has also started moving this forward from this is a hobby and this is just something that a couple of people on the internet are enjoying to this is actually a fundamental way of doing things and operating and changes the way that humans interact potentially for the rest of our lives.
This is extremely interesting. And just the crossover with what Brennan said with trustware and legalware, socialware, the idea of the abstraction of that is who can do what and what are the incentives and what are the penalties of taking actions in the design space of what you're allowed to do. The state monopoly on violence enforcing the legal system, supports people not doing things that we don't want to do in a coordinated society, and having specific constraints for what you can and can't do in a traditional finance system like KYC, KYB, AML. Those are off-chain, also enforced sort of through the legal rails. And then, what we're seeing with the on-chain stuff is that you can have these programmable constraints, which they change the shape of the design space of who is allowing someone else to do something. When we talk about permissionlessness or we talk about taking permissionless actions on, global financial rails, it changes the game, but we could still kind of create zones within that where they have very specific and different permissions. I also think that when we see things like KYC in the Web 2 world as a sort of transitionary state and, copying those things, creating a legal foundation so we can get those types of enforcement on chain, will create also non-skeuomorphic replacements for those things and the on-chain rails as well. So, under collateralized loans in DeFi is a huge holy grail that people haven't accomplished yet. There's still no real on-chain reputation that mirrors a sort of, or replaces a sort of credit score, at least for individuals. And I think that we're starting to move in that direction. So you say, okay, maybe we do KYC for stuff in a DAO or in an organization. You see a lot of that with like grants, retroactive grants and things like that. But then later on, so what's our kind of Web3 native version of that that's even better, more inclusive, better for the people who are involved, maybe better privacy respecting and not necessarily, disintermediating that from requiring it to be legalware. And I think this is just a general paradigm of the whole industry maturing, and that seems like one of the next chapters that's really exciting coming up.
I fully agree. I think the one other element to that is where. That's the biggest change. Is up until now, we have been slightly prevented based on borders in terms of what we're able to do. And that's what one of the larger changes is exactly that. Suddenly you can be anywhere in the world and you can still perform the same set of actions, which that's absolutely fantastic. And I keep going back to this, but we can send messages between the four of us on a group chat, and we can be in 4 different continents and instantly respond. And if I want to send money to the 3 of you, it's a 1 to 5 day waiting period if I'm lucky. And the way is crypto is changing that, because suddenly you can be anywhere in the world and your jurisdictional country doesn't matter in terms of what you're able to do.
Yeah. That's to a certain extent. There's tax implications and other things, yes. Right?
Fair.
Yeah, to a certain extent. But yeah, that was actually something else I was going to ask you too, because Karel, you mostly help organizations create these legal wrappers in the Cayman Islands, right? Is like the jurisdiction that you're most well versed in. And a lot of people, at least in the US, talk about the Cayman Islands a lot as this attractive place to form their DAO or their organization because of certain things. Can you just better explain why the Cayman Islands are such an attractive place for DAOs to put this legal wrapper? And then I guess maybe even to backtrack or to expand on that a little bit, how much does a legal wrapper really help create those protections for an organization?
Tough questions being asked. I'm going to have to start off by just saying I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice at all, and do approach your legal counsel. I think I'm going to answer your last question first and say, at the end of the day, this, broadly speaking, has not been tested in any court anyway. And I think that up until a court makes judgment on it, we will not know exactly what the court's view is. The fundamental concept of what a foundation company is, which is basically a marriage between a trust and a traditional corporate structure. Legislatively speaking, that works. And that is, I think, one of the key reasons why the Cayman Islands is becoming the destination for this. That there's a couple of other factors as well. It's a well-known international destination for finance, built out through the funds industry over the last 40 years. It sounds simplistic, but the time zone alignment with the US plays a key role in it as well. It is just easier to coordinate if you can touch base with whoever you need to. And it is close to the US on we've got 90 minutes flight from Miami. So all of those little things has a massive impact. And then the other one was just the Cayman Islands created legislation years ago when it comes to crypto. And the Virtual Asset Service Providers Act made it clear what falls under the jurisdiction of the regulator and what does not, and what the key distinction between those two are. And the fact that there was that legal clarity which was provided makes a massive impact in people's willingness to take a chance. Because then you can at least protect yourself from certain unknowns. You know exactly what those unknowns are versus playing in a jurisdiction where at any point in time, the law could change overnight. Well, not the law, but the actual what people almost believe changes overnight. And now what you were doing yesterday was fine, but what you're doing today is no longer okay. The Cayman Islands provided that legal certainty, and that has a massive impact in people's willingness to take risks. So all of those factors combined leads to currently just Cayman Islands, and I'm biased, being the preferred destination when it comes to it. And I think the uptake of the Cayman Islands also proves this.
Yeah. Have we seen yet, and the answer is probably no, but have we seen what the limitations of having a legal wrapper is? A legal wrapper only get you this far. Yeah. I guess we haven't seen any of that until a court rules on it, right?
Yes.
Again, I'm not a lawyer, as Karel so eloquently stated, a legal wrapper will not keep you from turning your asset into a security if you say, buy this thing and you will make money based on the work that we do, right? So the securities law still applies. All these other aspects still apply. I think part of what the legal entity, at least at RareDAO, has been extremely useful for is the ability to interact with the economy, like to be able to engage service providers. Karel mentioned banking. That was a big problem for us. I was hired to SuperRare Labs because we couldn't figure out how to pay an employee out of Cayman in a way that made sense for that employee. And so I had to, working with Karel and our foundation director, design that process before I could move over. And it was really interesting the way in which that involved us in like using our legal wrapper to engage with traditional systems. But then also, I'm going to name drop another service provider here, working with Rain Cards, which has this crazy solution where you use USDC deposited on chain to create an escrow that lets you have a credit card and wire transfers. And these integration points with the API of Western civilization, or just the global financial system generally, through the use of crypto technologies, and in conjunction with your legal entity as a point where these systems can make contact. So we're able to use our legacy, quote unquote, legal structure with these novel methods to get feature parity with what is already out there and do really cool things, like make sure every single dollar of assets held in a Gnosis safe in our foundation is secured through HATS protocol. Being able to do both of those things is very challenging. And I think that's the big unlock here. And having a legal wrapper, for us, I wouldn't have a thing to sign an agreement with as a contractor to have protections to know that under certain circumstances, I will be able to pay rent next month. There's trustware that you could do. You could put that in Sablier, but it's just an additional layer of trust. It's an additional layer of assurance. And what is trust, right? Trust is the ability for agents within a system to be able to predict each other's actions. I trust that Karel is going to, execute his responsibilities because we've defined those very clearly and we've set up the proper incentive structure for that to happen. So when we look at these different coordination mechanisms, they're all trying to bring legibility to how an organization operates so that the agents within that organization can understand the game that they're all playing and coordinate to win that game together. I think when we're talking just about human agents, where we can play that socialware really well, where we can read each other's body language, where we grew up for 18 to 30 years as teenagers and young adults, gradually gaining literacy with the financial system as it stands, with the legal system as it stands, with social systems as they stand, we bring a lot of context into our organization to be used to coordinate. But as AI agents become increasingly valuable members of teams and communities, how do we make systems legible to them? They didn't go to high school. They didn't participate in the student council election. So we need to be able to encode our systems and describe them. Because if we want to be able to trust our agents and have our agents trust us, we need to make sure that the processes for coordination are transparent and legible so that they can learn them, we can learn from how they learn them, and we can predict each other's actions in a reliable way.
One thing I've always been curious about is the relationship between labs, DAO, foundation. So for example, with SuperRare, there's SuperRare Labs, there's RareDAO, there's potentially a foundation now in the mix as well.
Yes.
Are those all the pieces? Am I missing anything?
Yeah, those are pretty much the pieces. I mean, you have the community too, if you want to separate the community from the DAO. The way that I typically think about it is that the SuperRare Labs is a Delaware C Corp traditional tech startup that had an idea to sell art on the internet through ERC 721s. Like it was a group of friends who were hanging out. They saw ERC 721 get published and they're like, wow, we can make a marketplace out of this, right? And then they did. And they made the relationships and all that stuff with artists and collectors to create this amazing business. And then, they wanted to do these other things. And I think it was Trake's episode of Roll Call where he talked about how grateful he was to the SEC for creating such a hostile environment for businesses, particularly US businesses, to operate in, that innovation was required to survive. It was a forced constraint that required adaptation. And that's what happened in our case, right? We had to adapt the structure of our organization to match the incentive structure of the legacy legal and financial system. And so the way that we did was to exit that system to a degree, right? To go offshore and to create a Cayman Foundation, because there were simply no viable options in the US in 2021 to have our community operate in the decentralized way that we wanted it to operate in. They made that impossible based on the risk analysis of our founders and legal counsel, community members, token holders, et cetera. And so we created a Cayman Foundation, right? Now, the DAO I consider to be the collective decision-making power and like the collective intelligence held by token holders as sort of the decision or dispute resolution kind of mechanism. It's a very ethereal concept. We still use off-chain snapshot voting, though we have like mechanisms for on-chain execution through the OSNAP module developed by UMA and kind of similar ideas. But it's sort of the collective intelligence of the token holders. So I see the DAO as being the intersection of the community, as in the people, the protocol, the on-chain limitations and physics of the product and organization, and then the foundation, sort of this reservoir where we stick the legalware and interface with legacy systems. So I see those as sort of the organs within the organization of the DAO, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So the foundation sort of serves as the I guess backbone or structure behind the DAO, and then the labs is like its own separate sort of
The
thing.
labs is just a contributor to the DAO in the same way that Lemma is a contributor, that my personal consulting company, Wiser Systems, is a contributor, that Hats is a contributor. Like I see those all as service providers on equal footing, where they're able to engage with the foundation to sign a traditional, services agreement that protects both parties. But they're operating in service of the collective based on some predefined goals that have either been sanctioned through direct community voted legislation or something in formation documents, but everything sort of like every aspect of the system is legally required to act in the best interest of the community. That's in the constitution of our foundation. If we stop doing that, I'm actually not sure what happens when a foundation violates its articles. Karel, maybe you could speak to that, but it is part of our physics in a very real way.
Court case? It's got to be my answer. Well, actually, I think on two things. All of us are these service providers to the foundation itself, and we can be fired. We can be let go. We can be swapped out with somebody else. And I think that's a core part of what this makes it work. Brennan, in terms of your question of when a foundation stops acting within the constitutional documents, that's where the supervisor steps in and can say, well, you're not acting in accordance with what you should be doing. And therefore, the supervisor steps in and there is a process from a legal perspective that will then proceed from that point onwards. But the structure is very well designed to allow real-world interactions with both the traditional sectors and the traditional world of business and finance, and combining that with the brave new world of crypto and the next evolutionary step.
Yeah. Is this structure similar to what we see in other organizations? Like, for example, going back to Trey's episode, like with Eigen, there's Eigen Foundation, there's the DAO, is there Eigen Labs? Or I guess Eigen Layer is like their version of the labs. Like, do we see this sort of similar model across many different DAOs, protocols, organizations?
This is the traditional, I'm saying traditional structure like it's a very old structure, but this is the structure we see most often, yes.
Yeah. And do you see this structure working well? Like, this is the best solution we've come up with today. Do you see it continuing to evolve in the future, or do you think this is like pretty solid? This is what we're going with moving forward?
I would love to say it's not going to change, but to make a smart joke, when you're going to rehash this Rehash podcast in 2 years' time, we might be saying there was a completely new structure that's been developed that functions way better and serves a way better need than this current one does. I mean, we've seen that so far. What we were doing 2 years ago versus what we're doing today versus what we're going to do 2 years from now. It's not going to be the same, but each iteration is better than the previous one, and that's what's most important.
What are still some of the challenges or the gaps that you're seeing today, other than things outside of our control. For example, regulatory guidance, these court cases that need to happen, all these things when we're talking just about things that we can control, like where are the gaps there still?
I think that's going to be and it comes with the maturation in the industry, but a lot of foundations are not thinking in terms of its useful life. So what I mean by that is a foundation gets funded today, let's say, from a TGE, it gets X percentage of the tokens. The way that foundation is being funded is by selling the tokens. That's a finite supply. If you sell the last token, you are done. So if you run out of money, then the foundation has no money left. And its only option then would be able to potentially go back to the DAO itself and say, hi, we actually need more funding to continue what we're doing. And that is currently starting to become very important, where foundations are having discussions to say, how do we ensure that this foundation will continue forever? And we're seeing entrants into the market like Exchange Solutions, who comes into the market in order to be able to serve that need and help foundations with extending their useful life past just the next bull run, but into ideally the rest of time and how that looks. And I think that's a very interesting scenario to be in. It's different to what the traditional world has been operating on. A company gets revenue, and that revenue drives the existence of the company. If the revenue stops, the company dies. Foundations are normally funded, and more often than not, they're funded once. But the foundation is also not, they're not employing 2 million people. What? So it's different to think about it, but that conceptual thinking is starting to happen, and those questions are starting to be asked. And I mean, that's within the power of us. That has nothing to do with regulatory certainty. We can do that right now. And the options that we have to invest funds has also increased tremendously versus 2 years ago. You staked your USDT and got 2 or 3%, and that was it. Now you have the Biddle fund as an example. There's just so much more options in order to extend lifeline of any foundation. And I think that that's going to be the next step that's going to happen in the foundation maturation process.
Are these things that, Brennan, you've already started thinking about with the RareDAO Foundation, or because I know you're still in the early days of that, so I don't know what stage your head.
Actually, it's something that we think about every December when the year closes down.
Santa comes and we see, foundation.
Yeah, exactly. Winter is an interesting time of year, right? You take stock of the work that you did over the course of the year and you plan for the next one. So this is when we have our budget proposals. Initially, our foundation just wasn't funded. It was minimal activity, minimal personnel, that sort of thing. And that put a lot of reliance on the labs entity and on volunteer community members. So over the last 2 years, we've been kind of starting to diversify that resource allocation so that we have this sort of additional entity that can incentivize community contributors and service providers without being over-reliant on the US, and having more capture-resistant framework for doing that as well. So last year for us, that took the form of just an annual budget, which is very different from how most foundations operate, as Karel noted. It was like, we think that we will spend this much money this year. These are the categories that we think we will spend on, and we'll be back next year, and you guys can decide if you think we are terrible at our jobs or not. That was a great approach for winning public trust, I think, right? Because it showed we are here to win your trust. We want to prove ourselves so that you can predict our actions, so that you know that we're good actors, and we're willing to stake our future on that performance. And so that worked out pretty well. The one downside of that approach is this space changes a lot, and the financial rails of the system are so strong and so deeply woven that every aspect of an organization that runs on chain, that there's an opportunity cost to running a purely cash business, right? Just relying on USDC sitting in a treasury that doesn't move when the market around us is so volatile. So this year we went with an approach to ask for a multi-year endowment, and it's tricky because the length of that endowment depends both on our business acumen, our ability to stay lean, our ability to drive revenue, kind of traditional business concepts, our ability to make smart investments and hire good asset managers. So also just how many boomers buy Bitcoin and their, IRAs and everything, they're the ETFs, and just the volatility of the market. So we went with this approach because we thought it was a fine balance, not just so it shall be, we exist, and we get 30% of everything that you own from the beginning of time, to like, we're just scraping by month to month, like constantly thinking about how we're going to write the next budget proposal, trying to find a middle ground where we can make long-term bets, where we can diversify assets, where we can stretch each dollar, right? I feel like that we have a responsibility to the community to make every dollar count for more than it's worth. And we do that through operational excellence. We do that through extremely deliberate, relevance realization around what matters for the business and for the customer, and being hyper attentive to where we spend our time and our resources. But we also do that by being smart with our money. Like, there are times when holding USDC is the smart thing to do. There are times when holding Ethereum is the smart thing to do. And having the flexibility to do that is really important. And I think that's something that some models have managed to do well in a decentralized way. But I also think that asset management is somewhat of a tricky thing. And it's a curation problem to some degree. And so what the route that we've taken is to pass a community proposal that sets up an allocation of funds, establishes a partnership with the service provider to do asset management strategy and execution. We took a lot of inspiration from the way that ENS structured their initial engagement with Karpathy and went through that proposal process. But, I really think that is important. Every single DAO needs to think about, how are we stretching our dollars? Because right now we're in adolescence and it's cool. Like, we've been living off of our parents. And I guess the parents in this metaphor is 0% interest rates for 15 years that create an artificially inflated tech economy where you can just do stupid stuff and make a bunch of money doing it, to whatever the chapter that we're in after that looks like, where we have non-zero interest rates and innovation is happening so quickly that you don't have time to become an incumbent anymore. And so fiscal discipline is really, really important. And that requires transparency. That requires accountability. And you also need the flexibility, though, within that framework to be able to respond to the market, to be able to make bets on the future, and to stretch every dollar through a responsible diversification of assets.
Reminds me.
Sorry, go. Well, I wanted to say on the next podcast, we can assess whether this endowment concept worked out or not.
There's something, a lot of the last bits of what you said, Brennan, sound so much like just operating a good business. So there's like all the complexities and challenges of, that aspect of this, financial discipline and creating a good structure and creating good budgets. And then there's sort of, I think one of the themes that we've seen over the last couple of years on the regulatory side is that you have that it compounded with the complexity of the market moving through bulls and bears, and then the regulatory environment shifting very rapidly and at the behest of many political players. So it's sort of this 4D chess of, okay, where does the DAO versus the entity of the DAO? Is it a wrapper or is it adjacent? And then, how does the foundation run a good business? How does the DAO run a good business? Who's involved from the community perspective or not? What actual authority do they have? And that's even before you get past the DAO is just vibes, people voting thing, right? You're now talking about specific roles, responsibilities, councils. It's wild to see the space maturing, but it also is so overwhelming to me to see, like, when all of these things have come to light, like the big giant list of like everything that needs to get done to make a really amazing DAO. But it also feels like really optimistic. Like we're making great progress with this great tools in place, great best practices, and I feel like we're just starting the next chapter.
There's a flow channel here, right? Like, we're in a collective flow state. As our abilities increase in the environment, so does the challenge that we are aware of. That challenge has always been there, right? Like, we weren't running as good of businesses 4 years ago, maybe. We just weren't aware of that because we were high on smoking 0% interest rate jokes. Yeah, vibes.
Yield.
No yield.
But, that's what maturity is. The scope of life increases as you grow into responsibility and ability and your agency as a human. And I think that's what we're all going through as a space right now. And one of the things that I love about this industry is the way in which, like, you can't do that alone. I talked before about how RareDAO Foundation is, we're a smaller DAO foundation. We have service providers. Like, we don't have as many in-house employees as would be typical. So we are very much a community of people working together, contributing in service of this larger community of artists and collectors. And just like maturing in real life, right? You realize how scary that journey is to go alone. You realize how difficult it is to forge your totally own path. And you also realize how much smarter other people are than you in certain aspects. And that by tying your rafts together, you can make a nice little group of people able to take on, the big challenges in the world. I think that's part of what we're doing. We're getting better at figuring out individual value adds. And part of that could be the bear market too, having gone through the bear market. And each of us having to really reflect on what value do I create? Was I just like barnacle on the boat of crazy US monetary policy? Or was I actually helping to push the craft along? And the people who stuck around, I would imagine, realized what they were doing to propel that boat forward and kept doing it. And that allowed them to sustain themselves. And that's not to put down or, anything, people who left and had to look to other opportunities during that space, but it's just the pressure cooker of surviving in a scarce environment. And now coming out of that, we have the ability to push each other forward as well. And that, I think, is what's really exciting to me about HATS protocol as this coordination mechanism between DAOs. You, Nick, have talked a lot about the conversion from a marketplace to a firm, how agents can go from competing to coordinating. And I think that's something that we all need to do. Because in many ways, like the challenge of just existing as a crypto business that tries to have some aspect of decentralization, as you noted, is so complex that it adds cost on top of normal business operation. So we all increase our chances of success just by making that part easier, let alone figuring out how to sell art or how to advise people on org design or what have you.
And it moves us toward a more collaborative world. But because the firms are formed under conditions where coordinating is a better strategy in the market than competing as a raw market participant, if we can bring coordination costs down with protocols and knowledge and best practices, then it increases the number of firms and increases the size of firms. And it means that more people are collaborating with one another. I think it's a much more exciting future to look forward to than just raw PvP and shitcoin markets. Like that doesn't excite me as much as like making extraordinarily intelligent collective organisms that are dynamic and evolutionary and can contend with the shifting regulatory environment, shifting fiscal environment, while being extraordinarily efficient and great places to work.
I fully agree. The one maybe outside opinion here is, as much as meme coins and shitcoins are, I mean, they are what they are. The beauty about what they also bring is, because they are so much fun, in general speaking, is that a lot of people on board because of it. And it goes back, like accounting isn't sexy. There's no way to you just can't. It's a lot of a beautiful structure that works fantastically well. It's fantastic on paper, but few people are excited by seeing a HAT structure. You need to understand it before you get excited about a HAT structure. And before you understand it, you need to get into it first. And if that's done through meme coins, then, beautiful. That works. It brings people into the space. It makes them spend that first dollar. It makes them make that first, purchase and see what this can do and be, I hope, amazed by the technology. And that then starts to translate into what we are now, where we are now excited about HAT structures and future of organizational structures and future collaboration. But it also starts with having a bit of fun. And I think that's so important, and we should never forget that part.
I agree with that fully. I was actually going to say something earlier, which is, a little counter to that. But I do think it's going to be a balance of like maturing, learning how to adult, as well as still having fun in the space. But I was going to say earlier, like as I was listening to Brennan talk about coming up with like a 2-year endowment plan, like I was thinking, like, I don't know if any of you guys feel this, but that almost stresses me out more than just winging it and doing everything last minute for like the next 30 days. Like it almost is more stressful because how do you plan for like a multi-year term in crypto, right? Like that is just like a crazy concept to me, because things change so fast and so much that we can't even predict what things are going to be like in 3 months from now, let alone 3 years. So I think it will be interesting to see this space mature and to see the people in this space mature as well. I almost think that a lot of like the earlier days of crypto brought in a lot of people with Peter Pan syndrome in a way, who kind of just wanted to play around with coins and, not really have a real job and just do whatever they're doing here. And I don't think this applies as much with the OG DAO people. A lot of the people that we've talked to on Roll Call, I think those people were always here for a much bigger and much more important reason than just, not wanting to adult. But I do think a big part of the crypto space is like that. And so it will be interesting to see as we move into the next cycle of really like crypto maturing, of regulatory things like getting to a point where crypto companies can create bank accounts and can do real things that companies can do, like how the people working in the space will adapt to that as well. And yeah, I will be curious to revisit this 2 years from now and like see where we're at now. Maybe listen back to this conversation. I would love to have like a real-time live streamed watch party where we just rewatch this whole conversation and just comment on the things that we said.
I would sign me up to that idea. I'll put it in my calendar right now. Dan, it is scary. I can tell you it's a lot scarier when it's sitting, Brennan and myself sitting on a call. I'm like, okay, so do we think we're going to have legal fees in 2 years or not? Which is exactly what sometimes happens. And I think that that's such an important part about it, but it forms a critical part of the maturing industry, is not only thinking in the next 30 days, but starting to think in the next 1 year, 2 years, and then at some point 30 years, and how we get there. And those we can mess up, we can make mistakes, we can go back and fix those. But somebody needs to make that first move and take that first step in order for us to proceed to where that eventually will lead at the end of the day.
There's a reciprocal relationship between community and the individuals within that community. For me, this is like the driving question of my entire career. Through deep relationship with the Hats team, we've made it like a key design principle of the proto DAO. But essentially, it's how can wiser systems cultivate wiser people and vice versa. The people in a system determine the quality of that system. We are constantly designing the things around us and curating the experience of what it's like to be. We are each other's environment, as the folks from Kernel like to say. And because of that, our environments, our systems make us better. They make us wiser. So there's a responsibility for every person in this space or every person in a space to make that space better. Like, I really believe that there is a really serious nature to what we're doing here, and that we are building something that will outlast us and be passed on to our children, to the next generations. And it is our job to make that thing good, to make it true, to make it beautiful, to make it wise. But at the same time, we have to have fun. And because that's part of wisdom too, right? That's part of being a good human. And if you're not having fun, then you're probably not doing it right. So, we just have to be in community. We have to learn from each other. We have to grow as individuals. We have to let that growth unfold into other people and be open to it, to be vulnerable, right? And sharing that growth, both good and bad, and be willing to incorporate those experiences from other people. And that is what is going to allow us to accelerate at a pace much faster than traditional organizations. If we can reach a level of emotional intelligence, emotional fluency, and just coordination capacity through better socialware, along with better legalware, along with better trustware, we will outcompete legacy systems. But it requires us to make better systems and to make ourselves better people in those systems.
Brennan, I can say right here that I feel wise after interacting with wiser systems.
That means a lot.
Same. And yeah, that's a big goal of the podcast too, right? Is bringing people on to be vulnerable about the things that they're working on, to share their experiences so that we can have this collective knowledge. It's almost like open sourcing this knowledge that everybody is working on and that we can grow together with it. So that's definitely a goal of mine too, with just podcasting, bringing people on that are building really cool stuff, that are thinking through things really deeply, to share their little corner of expertise with the rest of us so that we can learn from each other and all grow together. So that is our hope for 2025 and beyond. I am happy wrapping up on that note, unless any of you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners.
I think that's a powerful note to wrap up. It's a very optimistic year of 2025. Let's go.
Let's go. And Karel, Nick, please tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you personally, and then also where they can go to check out the DAOs that you're part of or any of the work that you're doing right now.
Go to superrare.com, look at really cool art. You can find me on Warpcast at Brennan. Twitter is at bmulligan56. But, we'll find each other.
Yes, we will. Karel?
Diana has caught me off guard to all the listeners on this question.
The question was just, where can people find you?
Yes, caught off guard. Brennan listing his entire Twitter handle by memory. You can find me on LinkedIn at Karel Olivier. I'm also live on the web.
Your Twitter, right?
Just type Karel into Google.
I just don't know what my Twitter handle is.
I'll find our Twitter handle and link
you go quickly. I can search my Twitter.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter 0xNN2 or farcaster@nintynick.eth, and hatsprotocol.xyz is the site. We've got the app, docs, case studies, and then Hats Protocol on Farcaster and Twitter to follow the project.
Okay. Thank you, Nick, for the break there so that I could do a quick search. You can find me on Twitter. It is at Karel, Karel, OLI, and the number 4.
Nice.
Perfect. And Lemma?
Yes, and Lemma. I think that's the most... I mean, Diana's done it for me. If you just Lemma, then you'll find it. You can find Lemma. I mean, Lemma is...
Oh boy,
solution.
We're going to have to work on it all. NGMI.
This has to stay in the podcast, but I mean, it's absolutely...
This is absolutely getting aired.
No doubt. Lemma is on Twitter at Lemma_solutions. I really should know that by memory.
You really should. And this tells us how much you're tweeting from your personal and the company account. So
they're LinkedIn maxis. When we did the event down there, and I first saw it because it came up on LinkedIn, and I was like, oh.
Well, when I talk about building integration points with legacy APIs, you need to have somebody on your team who does all that stuff. And Karel's a builder, he just is heads down, eyes closed, heads first, barreling towards the future. So who needs Twitter?
It sounds like you guys need an intern. When Lemma intern?
What a question that is. I'll work on that part, and then I'll work on a more Twitter activity.
Everybody send your intern resumes to Karel_Olivier at 4, whatever it was.
Also already messed up now. This has gone horribly wrong.
Anyone with a remotely similar Twitter handle is just going to be getting all sorts of random resume DMs to be an intern. They're going to be absolutely confused.
You can reach me by email. That's Lemma.solutions.
By fax, by carrier pigeon.
Yeah, if you train his carrier pigeon works really well. It's it's underappreciated as a communication method, honestly.
All right. Well, that'll wrap it up. Happy holidays. Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for tuning in to all 6 episodes of Roll Call. This was so much fun to do with Hats Protocol. Thank you to Nick for joining me on multiple of these episodes and being a great co-host. Thank you to Brennan and Karel for joining us on our final episode of this mini series. And I will see you all in the new year.
Thank you, Diana.
Thanks.
Great.
It's fantastic.